What would you do if one day you woke up and found out your house no longer belonged to you? Not because you sold it, not because of some legal dispute, but because a group of power-hungry neighborhood tyrants decided it was theirs to control? That's exactly what happened to me when I moved into what I thought was the perfect neighborhood. Wide, tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, quiet neighbors. On the surface, it was everything I wanted. But beneath that postcard-perfect image lurked something far more sinister, the Homeowners Association, or HOA. Now, if you've ever dealt with one of these groups before, you already know they can be controlling. They're the type of people who send you angry letters if your grass is half an inch too long or if your trash bin is visible from the street for more than 5 minutes. But this HOA? They weren't just controlling. They were relentless. It started small. A few invitations left in my mailbox, friendly-looking flyers urging me to join the community. A neighbor even stopped by to personally welcome me, casually slipping in how beneficial it would be to become a dues-paying member. I politely declined. You see, I had done my homework before moving in. My house wasn't originally part of the HOA. It was one of the few exempt properties in the entire neighborhood, meaning I had no legal obligation to follow their ridiculous rules or pay their absurd fees. That didn't sit well with them. At first, their attempts were almost laughable, gentle nudges disguised as neighborly concern. But when they realized I wasn't giving in, their tactics escalated. First came the passive-aggressive notes, left neatly folded and taped to my door. Then, official-looking notices started appearing in my mailbox, listing alleged violations I had committed, violations that didn't even apply to me. Then came the gossip. I'd see neighbors glance at me when I walked by, whispering just loud enough for me to hear. And then, one morning, I received a letter that changed everything. A fraudulent, carefully crafted document claiming my home had been mistakenly excluded from the HOA years ago and was now, due to a clerical correction, officially under their jurisdiction. According to them, I suddenly owed thousands in back fees. They even attached what appeared to be a revised deed that had been quietly altered at City Hall. That's when I realized what I was really dealing with. This wasn't just about power-hungry busybodies enforcing minor infractions. This was organized corruption. And these people? They had no idea who they were messing with. It didn't take long for the HOA to realize I wasn't going to roll over. I didn't acknowledge their fraudulent letter, didn't respond to their fake claims, and certainly didn't pay them a single cent. If they wanted a fight, I was more than prepared to give them one. But what I wasn't expecting was just how far they were willing to go. One night, after another long day at work, I pulled into my driveway, locking my car and heading inside like I always did. The neighborhood was quiet, the streetlights humming with a low electric buzz. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But by morning, that would change. The smell hit me first. A pungent, chemical stench burned my nostrils as I stepped outside, and then I saw it, *** my car, or at least what was left of it, *** a charred, twisted wreck sat in the same spot where I had parked it the night before. The windows had blown out from the heat, the paint was completely stripped away, and blackened streaks of melted rubber and plastic stained the pavement. The hood had caved in, the metal warped and curling like dried paper. Even after the flames had long been extinguished, the air still carried the acrid scent of burned upholstery and scorched wiring. I stood there for a moment, just taking it in. Then, to my own surprise, I laughed. Not because I found any of this funny, but because I knew exactly what this meant. The HOA had made a mistake, a colossal, irreversible mistake. They had crossed the one line you never cross. What kind of absolute idiot burns a federal prosecutor's car and thinks they're going to get away with it? I already knew who was behind it. No one else in this neighborhood had a reason to come after me. I had no debts, no personal enemies, and I barely knew anyone outside of the HOA members who had been harassing me for weeks. And considering the steady escalation of their threats, starting with petty violation notices, moving to fraudulent legal claims, and now full-blown property destruction. This was a message. A warning. But instead of making me back down, they had just handed me exactly what I needed. The obvious next step would have been to call the local police, but that wasn't going to cut it. I had already done my research. The HOA president, Marge Whitman, was good friends with the local police chief, had seen them together at community events, their smiles tight, their conversations just a little too private. Rumor had it that the HOA made very generous donations to the city's police association, which meant calling them was as good as letting Marge investigate herself. So I made a different call. A bigger one. I dialed a direct line and, within minutes, I was connected to a federal arson task force. My profession had its perks, and when I explained my situation, who I was, what had been happening, and how my car had been torched in what looked a hell of a lot like an intimidation attempt, it was like pressing a nuclear launch button. Less than 4 hours later, FBI agents were on my street. Sleek black SUVs rolled in like something straight out of a crime drama, and the second they stepped out, the neighborhood noticed, curtains twitched, front doors cracked open, and nosy neighbors gathered at a safe distance, whispering. It was the kind of scene that spread like wildfire. 1 minute, a quiet, upper-middle-class neighborhood, and the next, a full-blown federal investigation. I stood outside my house, arms crossed, watching as forensic specialists examined the charred remains of my car, taking photos, scraping samples, and securing any potential evidence. Meanwhile, a pair of agents started knocking on doors, asking questions. And then, Marge Whitman stepped out of her house. She walked toward me with that same smug expression she always had, the one that screamed, "I own this neighborhood, and I can do whatever I want." But there was something else this time, something underneath it. A flicker of unease. She glanced at the agents, then back at me, plastering on a fake look of shock. "Oh my goodness, Ethan," she said, shaking her head dramatically. "This is just awful. Have you called the police?" I smiled. A slow, deliberate, predatory smile. "Not the local police," I said, my voice calm but pointed. "I called the FBI." Her face drained of color so fast, I thought she might actually pass out. For a split second, I saw pure panic flash in her eyes, but she recovered quickly, forcing an awkward little laugh. "The FBI? Oh, Ethan, isn't that a bit much?" "Oh, Marge," I replied, tilting my head. "What's over the top is setting fire to someone's car, and last time I checked, arson is a federal crime, you know, something I happen to have quite a bit of experience prosecuting." She swallowed hard. I could almost hear the gears in her head turning, trying to figure out how much the FBI knew, what they had already found, and, most importantly, how much danger she was in, And from the way the neighbors were murmuring to each other, eyes darting between me, the burnt-out car, and the agents now questioning people on their front lawns, I could already tell that within the next hour, half the neighborhood was going to be talking about this. But this was only the beginning. Because what Marge didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that the investigation was about to dig up something much worse than just a little bit of fire damage. The HOA thought they could intimidate me into falling in line. They had no idea they'd just set themselves on fire instead. Marge must have thought she could contain the damage, maybe smooth things over with a few well-placed lies, the same way she always had. But she underestimated just how fast fear spreads. Because once the FBI started digging, people who had been too afraid to speak up before suddenly found their voices. And the stories that started pouring in? They were so much worse than I had imagined. It started with Walter Reynolds, the elderly veteran who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. I had barely spoken to him before, but that morning, after seeing the FBI agents, he walked straight up to me, his voice low but firm. "I need to tell them what she did to me," he said. I nodded, and within minutes, Walter was sitting down with the agents, recounting a story that had the entire investigation shift gears. Walter had refused to pay an illegal HOA fine a few years back, a fine that had come out of nowhere, supposedly for violating community aesthetic standards. He knew it was bogus, and when he challenged it, Marge had retaliated. First, the letters started, threats of more fines, then legal action. Then came the harassment, anonymous complaints about his home, sudden inspections looking for violations. And then, one day, he received a notice from the city declaring that his property was in violation of zoning regulations and had to be condemned. It was a complete lie. The HOA had pushed city officials, or more likely, bribed them, to declare Walter's home uninhabitable, forcing him out under the pretense of safety concerns. And once he was gone, the HOA bought his house at a foreclosure auction for pennies on the dollar and turned it into their private clubhouse. Walter had tried to fight it. He had gone to meetings, tried to get an attorney, even protested in front of the HOA headquarters. And what did Marge do? She had him forcibly removed by the police and banned from all future HOA meetings. That was the first story. But it was far from the last. Next came Linda Harper, a woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 10 years. Her story? Financial fraud on a massive scale. For years, Marge and her inner circle, including her goons Travis Mitchell and Greg Simmons, had been skimming money from HOA fees. Residents were charged exorbitant dues for community improvements, but no one ever saw the money being used. No new sidewalks, no landscaping upgrades, no repairs. Where was all the money going? Straight into Marge's pocket. Linda had receipts, bank statements, records of absurd HOA expenditures, even internal memos that proved Marge had been funneling money for operational expenses that just so happened to include luxury vacations, spa treatments, and fine dining. The agents listened, their expressions unreadable, but I knew exactly what was happening behind those cold, professional stares. This wasn't just a case of neighborhood disputes anymore. This was embezzlement, extortion, fraud. Then came the final blow. Brian and Melissa Parker, the couple who lived directly across from me, had security cameras installed on their property. When the FBI asked if they'd noticed anything suspicious the night my car was torched, Brian hesitated for only a moment before saying, "Actually, yeah. We have footage." And when they handed it over, it was game over. The footage didn't capture the exact moment the fire started, but what it did show was Travis and Greg loitering near my car late at night, minutes before the flames erupted. They were careful, trying to stay out of sight, but the timestamps and their body language told the whole story. They were involved. The FBI agents didn't even try to hide their excitement now. Because suddenly, this wasn't just a case of HOA corruption. This was arson, conspiracy, and organized criminal activity. By the end of the day, the entire neighborhood knew what was happening. People who had once avoided looking me in the eye were now coming up to me, shaking my hand, whispering about things they had been too scared to say before. The fear was shifting. For years, people had lived under the thumb of the HOA, too afraid to push back, too scared of the consequences. But now, they could smell the blood in the water. Because when a corrupt empire starts to fall, it doesn't just crumble, it implodes. And watching that process unfold, I was going to enjoy every second of it. By now, the walls were closing in on Marge Whitman. The FBI had the evidence, the residents had turned against her, and the once feared HOA was crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. But if there was one thing I had learned about people like Marge, it was that they never knew when to quit. She could have gone quietly. She could have lawyered up, tried to cut a deal, maybe even disappeared before the full force of the investigation came down on her. But instead, she did what all desperate people do when they know they're losing, she tried to shift the blame. One morning, just days after the security footage implicating her enforcers was turned over to the FBI, I woke up to find something unusual. An HOA flyer slipped under my door. At first, I thought it was just another last-ditch attempt to intimidate me. But as I read it, I realized what it actually was. A hit piece. The flyer, printed on official HOA letterhead, warned residents about increased criminal activity in the neighborhood. It claimed that certain individuals had been inviting trouble, attracting law enforcement, and threatening the peace of the community. There were no names, of course, but the implication was loud and clear. They were trying to paint me as the problem. As if on cue, Marge and her remaining loyalists held an emergency HOA meeting that evening. I didn't bother attending, but from what I heard, it was nothing short of a circus. Marge stood at the front of the room, voice raised, whipping up fear and paranoia, claiming that the real threat to the neighborhood wasn't the HOA's corruption but outside influences trying to tear it down. The tactic was cheap, desperate, and predictable. But she wasn't done yet. That same night, the HOA orchestrated their last, and dumbest, move. Around midnight, two figures were seen lurking near a resident's home. A few hours later, that house was broken into. Valuables were stolen, and in a laughably obvious attempt to frame me, a fake complaint with my name on it was conveniently left behind at the scene. It was sloppy. It was stupid. And it backfired spectacularly. Because the same security cameras that had caught Travis and Greg near my car days earlier also caught the same two idiots sneaking into the house. They weren't even subtle. One of them was caught on camera wearing his HOA badge. By the next morning, the FBI had the footage, and I knew before the sun had even fully risen that the investigation had reached its breaking point. That was the day the final cracks appeared in Marge's empire. The residents who had stood by her out of fear finally saw her for what she was, a fraud, a liar, and now, a criminal. The HOA had been a weaponized bureaucracy, used to control and exploit people. But now? Now it was turning against itself. And for Marge, the fall was only just beginning. The morning Marge Whitman's reign finally ended, the neighborhood looked different. Not physically, nothing had changed overnight, but there was a feeling in the air, a tension that had shifted. People stood outside their homes, murmuring to one another, waiting. And then, just like clockwork, a convoy of FBI vehicles rolled down the street. It was an unforgettable sight. Agents in dark suits stepped out, their faces impassive as they approached Marge's front door. For a moment, there was silence, then the sharp knock of authority. She hesitated before opening it, and when she did, I saw the exact moment realization hit her. She had spent years controlling this neighborhood, treating it like her personal kingdom. But standing there, pale and shaking, she finally understood that her power was gone. The arrest was swift. The agents didn't entertain her usual dramatics, didn't let her manipulate or talk her way out of it. They simply read her federal charges: fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and now, orchestrating arson and a staged burglary. Her hands were cuffed behind her back as she was led down the front steps, her neighbors watching in stunned silence. But as they put her into the car, someone from the crowd, Walter Reynolds, the veteran she had stolen a home from, called out, "Hey Marge. Looks like your stay here just became untenable." The neighborhood erupted into laughter. And just like that, she was gone. The fallout was swift. With Marge arrested, the HOA collapsed almost overnight. Its accounts were frozen, its leadership dissolved, and its remaining members scrambled to distance themselves from the corruption. Residents, once too afraid to speak, filed lawsuits demanding restitution. Within months, the HOA was officially shut down. For the first time in years, people were free. And as for me? Well, I received a hefty compensation check for my burned car. And in true poetic justice, I used part of it to buy an even nicer car, one that gleamed under the morning sun as I parked it in the exact same spot where my old one had burned. Standing there, sipping my coffee, I looked around the neighborhood, the same place that had once tried to push me out, now finally rid of the very people who had made it unbearable. If the HOA thought they could break me, they were dead wrong. In the end, it was them who disappeared. So tell me, have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.